one of the things that I've always been curious about, because I'm a theatre person, is really what do you see right now in Kerala in terms of trends in theatre? And from there, maybe we can shift our gaze a little bit to outside Kerala as well. And I might have some things to offer, you might have some things to offer. So let's start with theatre, because you're a theatre person, I'm a theatre person. That's what we feel most at home with. And then from there, we can move on to other things.
See, one of the first lessons that I've learned is never to perform with a performer. So the idea was that he would start and then I'll follow, but now he has turned the table and right now I find myself in this rather difficult position. I think that's probably a good point to start from. Instead of looking probably at the state of theatre in its entirety in Kerala, what is probably quite important right now is to look at the condition of political theatre. Kerala has had a very long history of political theatre and theatre which has contributed significantly to transformative processes in terms of the initial spurts of theatre itself in Malayalam. The earlier realistic schools, the earlier socially relevant drama, which then sort of took a very leftist political tonality to it. But much later, a bit later than that, what actually happened was that theatre kind of split into two different streams. One being more in terms of what you find in films, one being more focused upon what is considered art, etc., and the other being much more commercial in nature. And curiously, we called the commercial theatre as professional theatre, which is a kind of, a difficult term in a sense. But coming closer to our time, what we find is that there is a different quality of politics that is actually coming into theatre of late. If, generally speaking, political theatre in Malayalam has been understood primarily as leftist theatre, informed to various degrees by ideas, by concerns, by social agendas which are Marxist or pro-Marxist in kind. What has happened in the last 15 years or so has been that the politics has become redefined in a much more pluralistic manner. The rise of a number of new identity movements, especially in connection with feminism, the Dalit movement, transgender movements, the rise of alternative sexualities, etc., the gay lesbian movement, etc., all have found, very interestingly, very fertile ground in the theatre. We have probably, it may not be fair to say that it is a theatre which has actually been communicating with the entirety of the populace, but there is space. Spaces have been created. When I mention space, I mean not just theatre space in terms of the audience, but also actual spaces being created for that, spaces for rehearsals, spaces for work, where there seems to be a kind of natural extension of the political movements that are associated with these identitarian or these new social awareness schemes, and a theatre which seems to partake from that. Just to mention, like the work of Srija Aramodugara, or the work of feminist, playwrights as well as theatre people, the incidence of a number of late, the number of what you call incidents, so to speak, happenings, so to speak, which may not entirely answer the definition of a theatre production, but which is more performative in nature, all seem to actually indicate a flowering, a real effervescence of a number of different kinds of political theatres. So that is the context in which it seems to be taking place. And one possible reason for that, I wouldn't say it is a direct impact, but one possible reason for that in providing Kerala theatre today with a number of different idioms is, of course, the arrival, the 10-year-old long ITFOK, the International Theatre Festival. I'm not by any stretch of imagination suggesting that Kerala theatre has been borrowing from foreign plays, but there have been openings, at least in terms of the language of theatre, in terms of the techniques that can be used. This opening to plays from other parts of India, especially other parts of India, and also plays from other parts of the world, have clearly kind of helped them in creating their own particular language that suits their political agendas, and that's it. So that's how political theatre stands right now.
What you're saying is very interesting, and it has very interesting parallels with what I see as happening in other parts of the country as well. I mean, I'm obviously not in a position to speak about the whole country because theatre is very location specific, and it's impossible for one person, certainly a practicing theatre person, to me like me, to travel everywhere and to see it to see the theatre that's happening in different parts of the country in its own locale. It's impossible for me to do that, but certainly one does get a sense from, let's say, every time that one sees a festival or a theatre production travels to Delhi, or sometimes I end up watching plays in Bombay and Pune, and it does seem to me that at least 2 or 3 of the themes that you have touched upon could do with a little bit more of teasing out, in a sense. One is this idea that politics is no longer what we had conceived of in the 50s, IPTA, etc. That whole movement is something that all of us are familiar with. There's an entire new crop of theatre makers who are making theatre, who are engaging with politics without necessarily referring back to that tradition. And of course, there are new themes coming in. There are new sorts of movements that are impacting, in a sense. I'm not saying necessarily that these theatre makers are parts of movements, but the movements that are taking place in society around us, around issues of gender, around issues of ecology, around issues of gay and lesbian rights, sexuality, etc. All of these things that are around caste, around identity politics, and so on. All of these things are, in a sense, forming the larger world of ideas in which this theatre is being produced. So many of these theatre makers may not see themselves as activists, and they're not in that sense. But certainly, there's a larger political worldview, let's say, that frames their work. One of the things that I've been very struck with, if I were to just look at, let's say, the last 1 or 2 years, and some of the finest productions that I've seen in this time have been deeply political, but not in the conventional way, right? So I'm thinking of, let's say, the work of a playwright director like Abhishek Majumdar in Bangalore, and he's been very prolific. He's written a number of plays. He's produced them in India and abroad. His works have been picked up by the National Theatre in the UK, and so on. So he's really sort of at a point where he is straddling both these worlds. He's working a lot with international companies, but he's also working a lot with his own company in India. And if you see a play like, let's say, Muktidhan, which he wrote and produced, one of the things that strikes me very much about his work, and this is a pattern that I'm now starting to see. That's not fine. I'm now starting to see, in a sense, across the board, which is that there's an entire crop of theatre makers, whether it's Abhishek Majumdar in Bangalore, or it's Sharanya Ram Prakash in Bangalore again, or Purva Naresh in Bombay. All of these are people who are layering their works with a lot of research. Any play that they end up doing is preceded by, let's say, 2 or 3 years of solid research, right? And the days when you had a playwright who wrote a play, and then a director who picked it up and put together a cast and put up the play. That kind of a way of making theatre seems to be now a little bit sort of old-fashioned in a sense. And it's really exciting to see how these relatively younger, I mean, they're not young in that sense, they're all in the late 30s, 40s, and so on. So they've been around for 10, 15 years, they have a body of work behind them. They're, in a sense, mid-career artists, right? And it seems to me that the kind of work that was, in a sense, started by Sunil Shanbag in Bombay, where he started doing plays that were backed by a hell of a lot of research. The first play that he did of that kind, to my mind at least, is Cotton 56, Polyester 84, which was a play based on an excellent book, which was oral testimonies of workers in Bombay, and these oral testimonies were covering a period of about, not exactly a century, but certainly about 70 to 80 years, right? And this book became the sort of foundation for Ramu Ramanathan to write the play, and then for Sunil, along with a team of people, to do research around it, and then to actually produce the play. And that's been a pattern that he's followed in his work. When he started doing it, it seemed like it was relatively new, in the sense that theatre makers before that would not put in that kind of research, 2 or 3 years of research, and solid research. These were people who engaged with academics, who engaged with other artists, who engaged with people who had experienced that whole thing and so on. And if you look at the work of people like Purva Naresh, Sharanya Ram Prakash, Abhishek Majumdar and so on, seems to me that is now, in a sense, catching up as a kind of a trend. That solid research, engaging with your social reality, and not in a very obviously activist way, but in a deeply political way.
I think I agree with you entirely. In fact, if I were to just give 2 examples, which is exactly quite similar to what you've explained, there is this marked move away from a pre-written play text.
Right.
And the earlier idea of theatre as something that follows the establishment of literature, or as an extension of literature, has been put paid to largely. Where, in one sense, I mean, I would even call it the declaration of independence of theatre practitioners, where they make their own play text, so through the process of improvisation, through a collective effort, so to speak. And even when they seem to be taking play texts which are already existing, they make such mammoth, substantial changes to it that sometimes the text itself becomes totally unrecognizable. There are 2 instances that I think could be mentioned here. One is a play by a women's collective, theatre collective in Trivandrum, who took up the question of rape. And what they did, as you said, was to do extensive research on actual victims of rape, which happened in Kerala, in different parts of Kerala. And they followed up these cases, they interviewed the victims, and created an entire play based upon a series of these experiences being done almost like reportage. This is a brilliant, powerful play. I mean, what you saw there was effectively an entire range, spectrum of women being forced to go through the same kind of ignominy. And the worst part was what came out was the aftermath of that, the kind of treatment meted out to them by the police, the administrators, the people at large, etc. What is interesting there, and this is where I would probably differ from you, I would say that that is a kind of activism where instead of theatre becoming considered to be some kind of a follower of another kind of political activism, what one would call a mainstream activism, which was what was the case with earlier leftist theatre, where you have the political organizations, you have the political movement on the one hand, and theatre almost like a handmaiden to that. Right now, theatre itself has become a locus of the political struggle, where it is not through the taking of text from other sources, but through the creation of a text, creation of an entire play, through actual research and through the experiences of these subjects, where, most interestingly speaking, the idea of acting and presenting, where it is considered as representation, seems to come to a stop, and where the subjectivities of people involved in the theatre is foregrounded almost. It's not as if I'm representing someone else. It is almost as if I'm, as far as these women are concerned, it's almost as if they are representing themselves. The other instance that I have in mind is a play by Shankar Venkateshwaran, which, as he says, is a play that is constantly unfolding, so to speak. He started off with the Criminal Tribes Act.
I was in fact going to ask you about that, because
Yes.
I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard about it.
It's a brilliant play. It's a brilliant work, because he started with the Criminal Tribes Act, and what he did was he actually looked at the history of the Criminal Tribes Act, and he put two actors, one who is an upper caste actor and the other a Dalit actor trained in Ninasam from Karnataka, and putting them together, looking at the whole question of caste and how it gets into the subjective, interactive context of people.
And the play is in English, or
The play is in English, in Malayalam, and Hindi, and Kannada.
okay.
Okay, because
And the other actor is from Delhi, right?
the other actor is from Abhishek Nair.
Anirudh Nair.
Anirudh Nair. But what is interesting about the play is that as the play unfolds, slowly the fact that these are two actors representing two characters, what happens is that the Dalit actor tells a story of what it was during his childhood, of ostracization, of oppression, etc. And then they start thinking of making that into a play where they're representing. But slowly, the existential nature of the caste that they're part of slowly infiltrates into the very acting itself, into their improvisational process itself. And where the fact that one is an upper caste and the other is a Dalit certainly comes into it. It becomes part of the playmaking process, it becomes part of the play itself. So what I'm saying is, like, what in that instance, it's quite different from what the instance that I mentioned before. But the politics seems to be not a given politics, a found politics that is then given representation.
But is discovered
Exactly,
in the process of
exactly.
the making.
Where the theatre becomes not merely a device for representation or a device for a knowledge that is already present, but a device or a medium for recognition, for realization, for cognition itself. It becomes what one would call a knowledge pursuit, so to speak.
In one sense, it's quite similar to the experience that Sharanya Ramprakash had gone through. In the play Aksharamba, she had first gone and trained with a Yakshagana guru for 2 years. She herself did have some background in movement, dance, and so on. And for 2 years, she lived with the troupe, right? And she trained and she learned Yakshagana. And it was interesting how she talks about when she started to perform with them, it was a question what to do with this woman, because Yakshagana troops are traditionally men, right? And men play women's roles. Now, what do you do with a woman now? And this is a real woman. She has to eat, she has to sleep, she has to, conduct her daily life with the troupe, and especially when they're traveling, right? So what do they do? Yakshagana actors also tend to put on their makeup in public, right? So they would reach a village, and the site of the performance would be, let's say, a temple courtyard or something, and then some local person would host them, and the process of makeup would start, let's say, in the afternoon, after a meal and so on. They have a big meal, because then after the makeup is put up, they can't eat anymore, right? So the lunch is typically a very heavy lunch. It's massive, and then slowly they start to put on the makeup. Now, when they do that, men are bare body, right? And so, what do you do with a woman now? So, from those sorts of questions, and then of course the performance begins at night and carries on the entire night till morning. And after the performance is over, they take off their makeup and they eat again, and then they need to sleep. So then again, what do you do with the woman?
Yes.
Right? And what sorts of roles do you give her? Yeah. Does she play, let's say, the side roles, not so important, Shurpanakha and so on, or does she play male roles? And these are some of the questions that she brings into her own production, which she does with an actor who has been doing Yakshagana for the last 18 years. Right? So he's a trained Yakshagana actor. He's done it from the time that he was a child. He's grown up with that entire tradition, but is open to experimenting with it, and is open to asking questions about it. So the play is the story of this woman who gets into a Yakshagana troupe, and they're going to be doing Draupadi, right? And so the man is playing the role of Draupadi, and the woman is playing the role called Kaurava. And so Kaurava is a single character that stands for all the brothers, and of course within that he's, for the most part, he's either Duryodhan or Dushasana, right? But he stands for all the brothers. And then the negotiations that happen as they start preparing for the performance, and as the performances start happening. And Sharanya talks very movingly about how it was through the process of rehearsal and of creating the play, because they didn't have a text, that a lot of these questions of gender, identity, politics, and so on got foregrounded, and they had to be negotiated in a very practical, real way. What would it mean for a traditional Yakshagana performer now to be acting with a woman, not in the Yakshagana format, but in the format of the modern proscenium stage, where he plays a woman and she plays a man, And so what's the politics of that? And how much is he comfortable with the idea of critiquing the sort of patriarchal norms within Yakshagana? Because one of the things that also happens is that traditionally when men play these roles, apparently, I'm not so familiar with the Yakshagana entire tradition, but from what I've heard, it's often the case that audiences also would go to watch the male characters. Everybody knows the story anyway, right? So, and so what you're going to watch is, this particular actor's interpretation of Rama or Ravana or whatever it is, right? But there's rarely an instance where somebody goes to see the interpretation of a female role. That the female roles are more like stereotypes, they're more like cutouts and fairly two-dimensional. It's the male roles that get foregrounded as the roles to interpret, and so on. Now, if this is part of the tradition, then how do you respond to this tradition? How do you subvert it? How do you critique it, and so on? And what does the actor who's been part of this tradition himself, how does he respond to this tradition? And how willing is he to push these questions? How willing is the female actor who does not come from the tradition but who spent some time there? And that whole negotiation is a very interesting negotiation. It's as much what you see on stage as much as what you don't see. And it seems to me that there's a fair amount of theatre making that's happening today, which is really trying to negotiate this this terrain of the political contestation that is not actually played out on stage, but
Behind the scenes.
but is behind the scenes, and that frames the act of theatre. That unless you understand this framing, unless you understand that context, you would not be able to make sense of the play in the first place. It's not just a text that is going to be played out, and there's a story that is self-contained in the world of the play itself. So you're right. I think there's a fair amount of theatre that's happening today that's kind of drawing upon the questions in society and trying to explore those questions through the selves of the players themselves.
How do people, or how does a person who's part of a tradition respond to the challenges to that tradition, or the questions that come up as part of that, or the political assumptions which are part, the gender assumptions which are part of that tradition? I think what one finds generally, if you look at some of the traditional forms in Kerala, like Kathakali or Kudiyattam, that the younger performers are asking very hard, serious questions, not only to themselves, but to the form itself, the traditions, the devices, the techniques, the assumptions of the form. There are very serious questions being asked, and questions which are also leading to quite radical redefinitions. I'm reminded of the work of Usha Nanya, which we were talking of yesterday, where what Usha has been doing over the last 20 to 25 years, has been, effectively speaking, to put it in one term, has been the recovery of women characters in Kudiyattam, and the reclamation of the space of women, not just as characters, but as actors, as performers, the reclamation of the space of women within Kudiyattam. In fact, it is largely due to her work that Nanyar Kuta, as it is known today, the female form of Kudiyattam, has come to have that independent status as an art form all by itself. Now, her work, for instance, what she has done, again, we go back to the question of research. It's brilliant with the work that Usha has done. For instance, like there is a myth in Kudiyattam that the Panja Kanyas can never be presented on stage. It is a myth that is usually believed by all the performers, and that's why Sida, Kundi, all the Panchakanyas were kept out of the stage. So as part of her learning with Amanur Madhavachakya, she was going through the old Artapragarams and Kramadeepikas. And in one Artapragaram it is said that in this act, Sida need not be brought onto the stage. The word was need not be brought onto the stage. Kondu varendadilla enna. So what she does is to take this Artapragaram to Amanur Madhavachakya and her guru and ask him, it says she need not be brought to the stage. It doesn't say she should not be brought to the stage. Naturally, he says, where did you fish this up from? And we'll talk about it later. But the next day, a couple of days later, she comes up with another question. And that is an even more iconoclastic question. She says, now, if it is to be mentioned here that Sida need not be brought onto the stage, isn't that an indication that other women characters used to be brought onto the stage, and that it specifically needs to be mentioned here that Sita need not be brought onto the stage? So the interesting thing is, it is not just research, it is critical research that is actually taking place, mining centuries old Artapragarams or actors' manuals, and asking questions which probably only a feminist politics, she very steadfastly says she's not feminist, but she uses the word she is female. Okay, so but that's an even more political statement. But this critical research informing their work, where she has reclaimed so many characters, and then the culmination of that has arrived in her presentation of the character of Ahalya, who is actually a standalone character who is not present in any of the Sanskrit plays at all, and where this whole question comes up. And one thing that becomes very apparent in her performances and in her interviews too is that this is not a question of a representation alone. It is where the subject becomes part of the tradition, or the subject who's part of the tradition is asking questions of the tradition as well as of oneself, and where there is, literally speaking, an element of subjective expression that is taking place, subjective articulation that seems to be taking place there. And Usha's is a great example, and I would say that in a similar manner, there seems to be, to varying degrees, the same kind of significant questioning that is taking place within traditional theatre too, which brings us, and ostensibly this is never done in political terms. You know, as Usha says, I'm not feminist, I'm female. There is a very conscious, even I would say clever attempt to steer clear of the discourse of politics, of ostensible politics, but the act that they're doing, the work that they're doing, is manifestly political. There is no doubt about that. Can I turn the table, because I want to ask another question to you, because what has been happening in Kerala of late, if my understanding of it is to be taken, there has been an increase in the felt need for theatre. If due to the arrival of, say, films and then television, and the colonization of the private times of people almost entirely, and theatre was, there was very little theatre, say, 20 years back. What is happening right now is that there is more space, there is more requirement, and people are not just willing to go for plays, because earlier, if you would find it difficult to get people to go for plays, now it's not merely a question of people being ready to go to plays, and in Kerala, a very big surprising factor, they are prepared to buy tickets and go for, pay for it. They're prepared to go pay for it. And this is not something that is merely in the urban areas. You go to Kanjangad, or you go to, just recently in Irinjalakuda, they had a paid theatre festival, and the tickets were entirely sold out. I'm not speaking of huge ticket monies, but, sure, ticket prices, but they were priced, and the tickets were sold, they were bought by people, and that's happening. Is this something that, what you find is that there is a change in the composition of the audience, and there is a change in, there's a different kind of expectation that seems to be, coming forth.
I think that, so 2 or 3 things from what you're saying. One is that if I look at the city of Delhi, for instance, when I was growing up, I was a teenager, and I became interested in theatre and started doing theatre seriously myself. Basically, there was just one hub for theatre in Delhi, which was Mandi House. Right? So we went to Sri Ram Center and Kamani and LTG and the NSD itself. These were the 4 places where we went to watch theatre mainly. There were like 1 or 2 others, but not so important. Now, in the 90s, you had the India Habitat Center that came up. So that also started hosting a place. But that again was still in the same sort of, geographically, it was still roughly the same area, let's say. But Delhi has grown, and Delhi has grown exponentially, right? So Delhi today, the municipal limits of Delhi have a population of about 15 million people, which is the size of a mid-sized European country. Let's say the Netherlands has a population of 15 million people. If you see the NCR region as a whole, which includes Noida, and Ghaziabad, Faridabad, Gurgaon, etc., then you're talking about a population of about 26 million people, right? So it's huge. It's huge. These are like, it's like a country. Um, uh, if you drive through Delhi, then you will find that for about 150 kilometers from one side to the other, the urban sort of landscape of Delhi doesn't change really. You know, you don't get into the villages at all. Once in a way, you'll find some fields here and there, but you can see that urbanization has spread tremendously, tremendously. Now, in such a large city, how can you have theatre happening only in a small, 1 square kilometer area, right? It just doesn't make any sense. This was not the case with Bombay. In Bombay, because of the local train and because of the fact that that the geography of Bombay is north-south, it's a thin line actually, and because the local train goes north-south, it's quite interesting to see how, for instance, the Marathi commercial theatre, all the major locations where it happens, all the major auditoriums, are within sort of almost within walking distance of train stations, right? Because you want the middle class Maharashtrian to come and watch your play, and the middle class Maharashtrian is going to travel by the local train. So, so, so almost from the beginning, not literally from the beginning, but certainly from the 60s, 70s, and so on, in Bombay, theatre has been much more geographically spread, right, than in Delhi. Now, what's happening in Delhi, on the other hand, is if you see the last, let's say, 5 years, just the last 5 years, the number of theatre venues that have sprung up in Delhi is just incredible. Incredible. Many of them even I have not seen. Every day one hears of some new theatre venue that has opened up somewhere. Now, what's interesting about this whole turn is also, and I feel like this is a pan-Indian thing that's happening now. In the last 10 to 15 years, the number of theatre people who have started their own physical spaces is actually incredible. A number of people are now starting to think about, or have already done that, have created their own physical spaces either for rehearsal or performance. But if you create a space for rehearsal, you do end up eventually also performing in it. It doesn't remain just a rehearsal space. This is also to do with the economics of renting big auditoria and so on. It also has to do with a certain style of theatre. So in other words, if you're doing a play in Kamani, then there is a certain framework that the size of the stage and the size of the auditorium necessarily imposes upon you. Now, you may not want to do a play like that, right? You may want a play that you want the audience to be much more intimate with you. You may do a performance that may not be a play in that sense, right? But a piece of performance that might sort of break the barriers of the proscenium stage and so on. So through all of these things, what is starting to happen in cities like Delhi, for sure, also in Bombay, in Bangalore, but also interestingly in a lot of smaller towns. So there's an excellent theatre, sort of it's a theatre, let's say, it's a small theatre in Bareilly, where you would not imagine that there would be, theatre activity happening through the year. It's a doctor who set it up. He's a crazy guy, meaning he's crazy for theatre, and all of his earning he puts back into the theatre, and he's not trying to make any profit out of it. It's a passion, right? In Guwahati, my friend Berul Islam and Bhagirathi, they have turned their ancestral home into a theatre institution where the roof has become a black box theatre. They run a theatre school there, and so on and so forth. So across the country, you find that this is happening. On the one hand, this has to do with the fact that the state has, in a sense, failed theatre people, right? And And by and large, the Sangeet Natak academies, either national or state level, have not really paid any attention to uh, theatre infrastructure. And so creating, let's say, rehearsal spaces or cheaper performance spaces, etc., has not been part of their thinking at all, right? So if that is the case on the one side, on the other side, in the 80s or 90s, some people did try to get some large industrialists, etc., interested in theatre. Nobody was interested. Uh, and the answer is simple, because it doesn't have those numbers. At the end of the day, that's the crucial thing, right? So if the private sector is not going to support you, if the state is not going to support you, what do?
You support yourself.
You support yourself. And as a result, what has happened very excitingly to me is that there's a whole range of theatre spaces that have opened up in a number of cities that have been driven by artists themselves. Now, they may own the space themselves, or they may take it on lease or rent, or they may bring in some other partner, and so on, whatever it might be. But the thinking behind the theatre space, the running of it, etc., is actually done by artists themselves. And these are not people who are going there to make profit. They are not trying to look at it as a business plan and so on and so forth, right? So that's one thing that's really interesting and exciting. Secondly, the awareness that if the state is not going to support you, and if the big private sector is not going to support you, theatre still needs money and resources. Now, where is this going to come from? So the old idea of the theatre person himself or herself putting in their own earnings back into theatre and just subsidizing it forever and ever, that seems to be going out, also because people don't have money. I mean, a lot of like middle class, low middle class kids are coming into theatre. They don't come from rich families. They don't come from money, right? So where do they get money from to do theatre? They have to get it from their audiences. And I think this awareness is growing, certainly. It's not, sadly to my mind, it's not as strong in North India, where, for instance, in Hindi theatre, overall one finds, of course, I'm making a sweeping statement, so it's not true of every particular instance, but overall one finds that in Hindi theatre world, the moment you mention money, it's like a bad word. Whereas in places like Bombay, Pune, Bangalore, etc., it's not. I mean, people have a very practical attitude towards money. It's okay if audiences are charged. What you also find is that in a lot of these smaller venues, there's also an interesting way in which people are thinking about how do you get audiences, and how do you harness audiences' ability to pay. So, in other words, you want audiences of all kinds to come in, say. Some of them would be able to pay a larger amount, some of them would not be able to pay that much, but you don't want to prevent anybody from being able to see your play. So, therefore, what do you do? So, all kinds of methods are devised for this. Some of it might be pay as you will, and then you appeal to the goodness of heart of your audiences and you explain to them that, look, you have to support us, and so on. So therefore somebody might pay 50 rupees, somebody might pay 100 rupees, somebody might pay even 500 rupees, and so on. There could be that kind of thing. There could be other sorts of things where people say, okay, would you be willing to become a friend of this theatre group or this space, and so on, pay a like an yearly membership fees or something, and so on. But you're right that I think the overall attitude towards money is certainly changing. I've been part of an initiative that we have started in the last 3-4 years called SMART, which is Strategic Management in the Art of Theatre. And this is really thinking about theatre management for theatre people. So a lot of the management training that we have seen in the past that has been done for theatre basically involves sort of people with MBAs and people from management schools, like business management schools, coming and lecturing us about how we are wrong about everything. right? We don't know how to use money. We don't have business plans. We don't know this. We don't know. And we kept listening to this and saying, I mean, what the hell? We've been doing theatre for such a long time. There's so many people who run such successful theatre institutions, theatre companies, and so on. And you're trying to tell us that there's nothing that they're doing right. I mean, come on, that surely can't be the case. So a bunch of us got together, Sanjana Kapoor, myself, Sunil Shanbag, Samira Anger, Arundhati Ghosh, and so on. And we started thinking about, okay, what if we had a theatre management training course that is homegrown, that's something that we devise. We are people with years of experience in the field. We've actually done theatre, or we've run theatre venues, we've run theatre festivals and so on, and we've done it the hard way, with no support practically, right? So, and plus we know of enough instances, let's say like Ninasam, or let's say like Naya Theatre, and so on. These have been institutions or companies that have been there for 50 years or more, and we know how they function, we know how they work, right? So can we pull together all of this stuff and turn it into a training program for theatre people? So the idea being that you're not teaching like business management. That's not what we're interested in. We are not interested in that whole, the moment you go there, then you are entering a minefield, and it's the death of theatre as far as we can see. And it has had a very pernicious effect on theatre groups across the country. I know what that has done. So when we started this, we were not sure of whether theatre groups will sign up for this or not. And it's been incredible that every year when we make the announcement that, okay, now the course is going to take place, and so on, we get about between 75 to 100 applications from theatre groups, right? Out of which we can only take about, let's say, 17 to 20 groups, right? So, and what's been also interesting is that these applications are not coming only from the big cities. Of course, they're coming from the big cities as well, but the number of applications we've got from smaller cities is just incredible, So I think that there's a whole change in the way in which people are looking at theatre ecology, or the larger theatre ecosystem, and thinking about the relationship between physical space, as in venues, and rehearsal space, like physical infrastructure, audiences, and how do you build audiences, how do you sustain audiences, and the economics of theatre, and how does all of this then go on to support the artistic work that the company wants to do.
Almost bringing all this together, there is a development of an economy of theatre, an ecology of theatre, structures of theatre. In one sense, it all appears to be, it's an upward surge. But the interesting thing, or a contradiction, is that all this is taking place right when we have, for the past 10 or more years, a dispensation that is completely inimical, not just to theatre, but to free thought, to critique, etc. If I may put it much more bluntly, we have a much greater political theatre talking about the rights of women, the rights of Dalits, the rights of subalterns, especially at a time when the violence that is being inflicted on these groups are much more than before. And in fact, it has become institutionalized, so to speak. And on the other hand, we also have infringements upon the right of expression in a very systematic manner, which is clearly under. I mean, when we speak of vigilante groups, we have art vigilante groups. Even in the cultural sphere, we have these vigilante groups, working their agendas out. So, how do we see this as a real question? Is it a contradiction, or has this kind of response come in response to the rising tide of intolerance on the one hand, or is it a contradiction? What is actually happening here?
Well, personally, I don't see it as a contradiction necessarily. In other words, if one were to look at theatre history itself across the world, one would find that the more intolerant, let's say, ruling elites become, the more is the propensity for theatre makers to turn towards political themes. Now, this is obviously not a one-to-one sort of equation that one is making, but by and large, one would find that more political theatre gets start to get made in contexts where there's more repression, or there's more intolerance towards free speech, or towards particular groups and communities and so on. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, which I feel is more in the case of street theatre than in other kinds of theatre. So one of the questions that we keep getting asked all the time, Jannatimans, is how come you are still performing, and you say you've done 200 shows, 300 shows in a year, etc. How come you're performing so much, and how come you've not been stopped? Now, one simple reason why we continue to be able to perform is because we are so unknown.
Okay.
And because we can go under the radar quite easily. Now, if you're not going to advertise your shows, if you're not, and so on and so forth, and it's very hard for us to do that. Even on social media, for us to be able to say exactly where a play is going to be happening is impossible, because often we also don't know. We just know the general area. We know one point of, let's say, rendezvous, where some local comrade is going to meet us, and then from there they'll take us into the basti. Now, where exactly in that basti is the play going to happen, and how to bring external audiences there, it's impossible. So the fact that we go so much under the radar, the fact that we are not reported upon, we are not written about, we are not, there are not hardly any, very few YouTube, let's say, videos. Nobody does a Facebook live with a street play by Jannatimans and so on, which is all very good. The fact that we are totally unknown, even as individuals, we are not very well known, right? So all of this actually helps us to be able to do what we are doing. Because one of the things that the right-wing groups do is that they latch on to things that are famous to begin with, right? And so therefore their attack or their look is towards, let's say, Bollywood. Because Bollywood is famous. If I create some noise about some film or something or the other, I'll become famous because the media will pick it up and so on, right? So they are always seeking to write piggyback on something that is already famous, right? Now, because theatre on the whole, and certainly street theatre, is not, newsworthy, therefore we are insulated a little bit, relatively, which of course doesn't mean that there's, that nobody's been attacked and so on. Of course there have been attacks, but relatively speaking, we've been insulated from this right-wing sort of vigilantism. And on the ground, what happens, practically I can tell you this, is that because the play basically lasts for over 20 to 30 minutes, by the time they even realize that something is happening, it's over, you're gone. It's hard to attack us. It's not so easy, unless you know what's happening, etc. Which is not, again, to say, I'm not trying to paint a unnecessarily optimistic picture of the situation. It is dangerous. It's not like there are no dangers involved. You have to be careful. You have to make sure that you're protected. You have to make sure that there are local people who know you, who respect you, etc., etc. All of those precautions have to be in place, right? But it is still possible, despite everything, despite the fact that we have now officially entered into Ram Rajya, and Achhe Din have arrived, and we are all in heaven, and so on. Despite all that, it is still possible, if you really want to do it, it is still possible to be a little bit of a troublemaker.